Hello and welcome back to the Accelerate webinar series on demand, where we talk about everything it takes for a faster go-to-market strategy for medical devices, and also what constitutes a good strategy for medical device companies looking forward from 2020. This series is brought to you by Aventec in collaboration with Dassault Systems. I am your host and moderator, Shashank Danivadecker, and today we are welcoming back Stuart Wright, sommelier expert and business consultant, and Stephen Levine, the Senior Director of Virtual Human Modeling at Dassault Systems. Stuart, in the past episode, we finished on the note that automation within simulation is going to become a valuable skill set. This idea of being able to not just produce one design or, as you mentioned, one chair per craftsman or designer, and rather make the choice and the strategic choice to iterate more designs. So, can you elaborate on that?
We've got to, so we question ourselves about how do we move from a deterministic one chair per day kind of paradigm into 1,000 chairs a day. And clearly, it's not economically scalable. It's not feasible to suppose we can just have 1,000 craftsmen. Of course not. So what we have to do is take the craftsman's proven methodology or the discipline that now exists within the customer that all structural analysts say are using, and they all recognize it's the best practice, but we need to automate the heck out of it. And that is a very significant part of our strategy. So we can do that. Now, automating the heck out of it presumes that it gets done a lot, and we do it so that we can do it, execute the process a whole lot more. So imagine this, it starts with a designer detailing a part, and the designer is looking for how sensitive this part is to variations in manufacturing. Now, automation means taking the part off that designer's desktop and taking it through the entire structural evaluation process, potentially without the designer ever having to touch it, or without a simulation, an analyst, a craftsman, ever having to touch it, and the results getting fed back straight to the designer. Whereas before, the designer would have to give it to the analyst and say, hey, John, please make a finite element model of this. I want you to analyze it for displacement and maximum stress here at the root. I want you to do this, I want you to do that. And 2 days later, John would give the designer an answer. What we're talking about now is enabling the designer to run the entire process his or herself, but not just do it on one set of dimensions for a part, do it on hundreds of sets of dimensions for the part so that he can understand how the tolerance in manufacturing really will influence that performance. So we do it, we do automation, but we add something to it. It's not just the automation of the model build process and the analyze process and then the results interrogation process. It's automation of variation of the design itself. It's automation of plugging in variation to the material properties, plugging in variation to dimensions, plugging in variation to external loads and loading conditions, and automatically cycling through the entire space so that in the time it would take to get one result, we're now getting 1,000. And together they mean an awful lot in terms of insights and enabling intelligent decisions to be made regarding the device.
And the anticipation or the hope here is that by doing so, by being able to study the variation and being able to model that at scale, and thereby trying to make the device more robust, you're also gaining an advantage in bringing the product to market, because if you're able to now analyze 1,000 variations in the design, which each of which represents a statistical equivalent of a particular kind of patient or scenario, that will in effect make you, at least allow you to get to market faster because you have studied more ahead of time. Is that an accurate conclusion one can make?
For sure. And I think your product gets to market with less risk.
Less risk. Okay. Now, so is that something that's quantifiably less risk, or is it something that's perceivably less risk as a result of simulation?
I would say at this point, and at this maturity of simulation, some areas we can quantify, areas where the models have been developed, particularly in the area of things like knee implants, where they're very mature. But in most domains, it's still the ability for the manufacturer to anticipate the results and having eliminated the risks in design uh, in the preclinical work before the first clinical trial starts. Uh, so it over time we'll be able to quantitate those because we'll know these models will be tested, validated against the real world, and we'll be able to quantify them. At this stage, we're just entering that domain, I would say.
And it seems to me that if companies start taking the initiative more and more and start to build these, like make building of these models a priority and start to do that now, in a short future, we could be looking at these models allowing us to make the device quantifiably less risky.
Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I think we will fairly soon, if the industry coordinates the collection of material properties, et cetera, models, we can easily get to a point in the next few years where populations for given uh, domains, for example, valve replacements, we could have an entire model library that we know represents the patient population for an aortic valve replacement. So any new valve that's tested, you immediately know what the population it will be, it will see in practice. We shouldn't, there's no reason to believe that the human population will change 10 years from now. And so once we have that population represented, it's quantifiable, and from there on out, we can know it.
And
Now,
go
it,
ahead, Stuart.
it, it, it is a, this is a rather interesting dynamic that starts to develop, a dynamic paradigm. We're talking about variation, right? So imagine a cloud, and it's a cloud of points, and that represents the population of heart disease patients in America today, right? In some dimensions. And we're applying a new heart valve to that population. And we know that the heart valve operates at its optimum in only a subset of that cloud of patients. We know that. We know that from experiment. We know that from simulation. So that represents an application today. But we started talking about by talking about personalization. And there's a relationship here between a refined understanding of how a device will perform and an ability to engineer that device to an individual. Or let's not be so ambitious as to say to an individual. Let's simply say to a subgroup within a population. So now, because we have a refined understanding of how the device performs, how it's sensitive to variations in its world, we can now see how we can engineer the device a little differently from model to model, from part number to part number, to accommodate that variation more effectively. So we've engineered a device, it's good for a subgroup, but if we make this just a little bit thicker, we know that it will then perform better in a different subgroup of the population. And then make that a little bit broader or a little bit stiffer material. And that new part number performs just a little bit better in yet again a different subpopulation. Now, if you imagine taking that to its logical conclusion, you find yourself with the ability to refine the engineering of the device so much that your populations that it addresses are individuals. They're individual people. And that's what we're talking about with personalization. It's this incremental increase in fidelity on our understanding of how a device is going to perform that allows us to engineer into the device both robustness, which means it's tolerant of variation it's not necessarily expecting, but it's also engineered with features or functions or capabilities that allow it to be tuned or adapted to an individual patient, because it's been engineered so well and it's now so sensitive and we understand its performance so intimately that we can engineer that personalization capability, that adaptability. So what I'm saying is we can't get there with deterministic simulation. We have to go through this step of multi-run, Monte Carlo, design of experiments, sensitivity studies, all of those things. And we need to be doing a great job of correlating our simulation with physical testing as we go, validating it, making sure it's giving the best possible reliability that it can. It means applying systems like V&V40 to give us an auditable capability for the simulation so we know what its pedigree is. And ultimately, we can get to that point at which, because we've automated, we've massively increased bandwidth, we can engineer for personalization.
And I think a lot of this experience that Dassault Systems has gained, and I think you've definitely gained it through that Living Heart project that you've successfully launched. Could you talk a little bit about how that project has especially helped you in understanding the role of building these complex, robust, and stochastic models in developing that confidence?
Uh, well, thanks for highlighting that. I think it's been an incredible learning experience from the start. When we began the Living Heart project, we had a belief that there was a lot more knowledge out in the community than had been collected into one place, and we knew that as we tried to build individual models, the complexity of a system like the human heart was so challenging to us that we kept failing and finding ourselves seeking out new experts. And very rapidly, by launching the project, those experts started to find us. And slowly but surely, the process of adding knowledge to the whole started to take shape. And we were able to identify the areas of ambiguity very quickly. We started to find out what we had robustness in the model and what areas were highly sensitive. So we could see where the properties could be approximated and you could still get reliable results. And of course, the nature of that project, we had hundreds of people testing the same model. So to Stuart's earlier point about the craftsman, one unique thing about the craftsman is the same person who builds the model typically tests it, and we know that's not best practice in the real world. And so at the Living Heart project, we had hundreds of people testing the model and providing feedback and testing it in dozens of different applications. So we were able to get a very 360-degree view for what we could reproduce and what we couldn't. And then, of course, have a community who could then have a platform, essentially a human heart, which could house the individual domain that they're interested. If they were studying, for example, a mitral valve, they didn't have to treat that mitral valve as if it were out in space or in a bench. They could treat it as if it was in an actual human heart with realistic boundary conditions, realistic flow dynamics, etc., without having to become an expert in building all of that. And the ability to coordinate those pieces demonstrates that if we work together, we can really solve this problem.
And how long did it roughly take from the inception of the Living Heart project to reaching some level of fidelity that is boastable, to say the least?
Well, I think that's the most amazing part of the story is that we launched the project, excuse me, in May of 2014, and by May of 2015, 1 year later, we had a product available to the market. We had the first publication out. So, and then a year later, we had it available on our commercial platform. So it went from the isolated heterogeneous pieces of information to enterprise quality simulation in 2 years.
Okay, now, and the reason I asked that question is because any company looking to, build robustness into their devices or try studying, use virtual human modeling for whatever domain within the human body they are dealing with.
Mhm.
Any company who tries to do that, they're going to be at first very frightened by the amount of investment that goes into something like this, right?
Yes.
They may already be frightened by the amount they're spending right now, where you could have from $100,000 to $100 million, any number within that range could be something that a company spends. And especially new startups coming up today, they are conscious about the fact that regulatory compliance is probably one of their biggest hurdles, and so they're probably looking to augment that with simulation. So considering all these factors, um, how would a company, or how should a company think about simulation? Like, how would they get over that initial hurdle of like, okay, this is going to cost a lot? Like, is there a certain profile of companies that will be best suited for this, or companies across the board might be able to take advantage of this as long as they maintain their scale?
Well, from my perspective, you asked a couple of questions. So
Yeah.
what's clear to me, and as we've seen across the board in other industries, is that the cost of doing it right the first time is always much less than getting it wrong. And the cost of failure, particularly in medical devices, can be astronomical and put companies completely out of business. So the cost of simulating your device in a human-like environment very early is really a fraction of the total cost of bringing it to market. You add on top of it the likelihood of success and the speed at which it's likely to make it to market, the return on investment is pretty straightforward and quite significant. Having said that, many companies have to make an investment in a new skill set. So even though, as Stuart alluded to, the tools are becoming more generally available and more generally usable, they're still complex at this stage. And so smaller companies still need to make a certain investment in in an analyst and engineer skilled with computational tools, not necessarily with our models, et cetera, because these are relatively straightforward, but they do need to understand the details of running computation. But we're quite confident that that investment will reap benefits many times over.
Stuart, anything to add to that?
Yes, I think what we certainly advise our customers to do is, and it might seem obvious, is to use due diligence when they're planning for leveraging more extensively a capability or the capability that is simulation. And due diligence means planning for it, doing a proper inspection of what represents core capabilities that would really have value to you from an innovation point of view. So you might be innovating the quality of your product. and you ask yourself, what kind of simulation will really help me do that? And how much is it going to be worth to me in the marketplace to innovate that quality dimension? And once you've done the full assessment across the breadth of possible applications of simulation, make a qualified economic-based judgment on what should I own and what should I not own. So to Steve's point, which capabilities do I need to bring in-house, and for which I need to develop an internal capability, which means an internal skill set, and an ability to distribute the capability internally to more than just one person. But then, on the other hand, which do I not own but want access to? In other words, who can I consider a partner who can carry the burden of ownership of the skill but can still execute defensible simulation for me as and when I need it on a less regular basis? And then go out and identify that preferred partner and recruit that preferred partner, service organization, call them what you will. But do due diligence in evaluating what you really need and on what kind of time frame you need it, and develop a plan. Actually plan to evolve simulation. This is something that I think in general is not really happening in the life sciences industry. And it didn't happen for a long time in aerospace or automotive. But they did catch on to the fact that if simulation is a discipline that's going to be a strategic discipline for us, then we need to treat it and take it seriously. We need to treat it as a strategic discipline, and we need to take it seriously. And that means planning for it, planning for its integration, planning for the skill sets we need, planning for deployment against projects.
Let me add one of the other elements to the cost, and you referred to the Living Heart project earlier, and one of the concepts that we were hoping to achieve with the Living Heart project was a dramatic reduction in the barrier to entry for individual companies to get into simulation in the market on two fronts. One, as I said, we were making the investment to bring together hundreds of experts to create this model. So each company never has to make that investment. It's immediately available. In addition, we've created this community of experts with dozens of publications demonstrating how the product works, its capabilities, limitations, etc. So by utilizing, in this case, in the cardiovascular world, we've now created a situation where you could go from zero to expert very quickly. You have access to the world's most sophisticated model and a community of experts, many of whom are in the research community that are immediately available, either to advise you for services, and the community of companies like Aventec who can have that domain expertise and immediately provide you with support. And so we believe that that's a important model that we hope to take to the other domains, looking at neuroscience in the brain, lungs, musculoskeletal, hips, knees, etc.
Thanks, Stuart. That was definitely useful. But what I do want to touch on, and I think this is a great point to close out, is from what you mentioned, Stuart, about how companies need to start planning for these things, planning to make these changes, planning to include simulation as a strategic initiative. Uh, any company listening to this would ask the simple question, like, how do we get started? What comments do you have based on past successes, even maybe drawing from the Living Heart experience? How can a company go about getting started in this? Because if a company does simulation today, they may already know how to get started. For companies that don't do it or companies that are considering it, they may be a little bit lost. Even companies that already do simulation, they may be a little bit confused as to what the next steps could be, where they could truly sees the day and truly sees the opportunity that exists by using simulation to ideate the right product and eventually get to market quicker. So how would they get started?
Sure. The first thing they should know is that they're not alone. Um, we have we recognize our customers' need for assistance in plotting a course for the strategic use of simulation, the integration of simulation, the leaning out of simulation processes to make them more economically viable, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we and all of our partners subscribe to a value-based approach to engaging with customers. Now, what that means is invite us in and we will work with you to use a value-centric approach to assessing your needs. And once your needs have been assessed from a simulation point of view, we will evaluate different strategies for satisfying those needs. And evaluating it means what would it cost to own or what would it cost to outsource? How would value be derived from simulation? So not only what is its cost, but what value does it return? Does it help to eliminate physical tests? Does it help to compress development cycles? So work with us is the simple answer. Work with our partners. Invite us to come in and have an objective conversation, an objective discussion, which may lead to a very structured approach to evaluating the environment for simulation. Um, and allow us to work with you to build a plan. It's as simple as that, really. Uh, it's our where was I going to go? I lost my thought. You'll have
It's
to edit
our
that,
is it
obviously.
our craft, would you say?
It's a skill set that our field personnel have, is to take a business perspective to simulation and not just a technical one. Of course, the technical perspective is of utmost importance, but the economic perspective is almost as important when we're talking about working with you to help you make simulation more strategic. And let's face it, it's not a question of if simulation will be more strategic. It's simply a question of when. All of the dynamics are in place. Um, our capabilities in being able to simulate devices and the device to human interaction are forever increasing, and they're at an extremely capable level right now. There's not a lot cannot be done with simulation. So there's that dynamic. And there's the dynamic that the FDA is welcoming strategies from industry, from our industry and from the medical device manufacturers industry, strategies for leveraging simulation more extensively. And the FDA, as we've said, are working on those strategies themselves. That's a very important dynamic that is also opening the door, plus the financial pressure on customers to inflect that cost curve, inflect the development cost curve, reduce the time and reduce the cost, and give themselves more bandwidth. All of those things are coming together to say simulation must be relied upon more as a strategic capability. So it's not a question of if, it's simply a question of when individual customers take that step. It's already happening.
And that's a great point to take away from our talk today. Thank you again, Stuart and Steve, for joining. For our listeners, simulation, as you have heard, can be extended outwards from just structural, fluid, electromagnetic, and other technical computation. Simulation goes beyond that to allow designers to model variations, and there has already been some success reported with the Living Heart project on the use of simulation to build models, which are allowing designers to truly cover the variety in patient populations. This major shift is already underway in the life sciences industry, having learned from the aerospace and automotive industries. And if you're trying to see how to get started and set strategic goals in the short term, midterm, and long term so that you can make healthcare and patient care more inclusive and you can achieve that goal reasonably, then don't forget to tune in to our next couple of episodes. To learn more, you can find us at www.aventec.com/contact us or call us at 905 305 1711. The next part will be made available on demand next week. Until then, continue to let our knowledge empower innovation in your business. This is Shashank, your host for today. Thank you once again to our panelists, and thank you for listening. It's been a pleasure.